2,300 men. That was the only thing standing between the heart of Europe and total annihilation. It was the end of summer in the year 1566, and the air over the Hungarian marshes was thick with the smell of stagnant water and impending death. To the west lay Vienna, the golden prize of the Christian world. To the south, a storm was rising that would block out the sun. This was not just an army. It was a moving city of steel, fire, and fanaticism. The Ottoman Empire was on the march. Suleiman the Magnificent, the ruler of 3 continents, was coming north to finish what he had started 37 years ago. He was 72 years old, his body was failing him, his legs were swollen with gout, his face was lined with pain, and he could no longer sit in a saddle. He traveled in a horse-drawn litter like an invalid. But do not let the frailty fool you. Inside that broken body lived a mind of cold, calculated ambition. He knew his time was running out. He needed one last triumph to seal his legacy. He needed Vienna. But first, he had to crush a tiny, insignificant fortress that blocked his supply lines, Szigetvár. On the map, it looked like nothing. A few stone walls rising out of the mud surrounded by the Almaz stream. A tactical nuisance, a speed bump. The Ottoman commanders looked at it and laughed. They had an army of 100,000 soldiers. They had 300 cannons. They had the elite janissaries, the most feared infantry in the known world. They expected to sweep this fortress aside in 2 days, perhaps 3. They were wrong, and that mistake would cost them an ocean of blood. Inside the walls of Szigetvár sat a man made of different metal, Count Nikola Zrinski. He was 58 years old, a Croatian nobleman with a face scarred by decades of border warfare. He knew the Sultan. He hated the Sultan. For years, Zrinski had been the thorn in the Ottoman side, raiding their caravans, ambushing their patrols, and bleeding their garrisons white. He was not a diplomat. He was a killer. When the dust of the approaching Ottoman horde appeared on the horizon, Zrinski did not panic. He did not send frantic pleas for mercy. He looked at his 2,300 men, most of them Croatians and Hungarians, heavily outnumbered and completely isolated. And he told them the truth. There would be no reinforcements. The Austrian emperor was paralyzed by fear miles away. They were alone. Zrinski knew he could not win. The math was impossible, but winning was not the goal. The goal was to make the Sultan pay for every inch of ground with a mountain of corpses. The goal was to buy time. Every day they held out was a day Vienna could prepare. Every Turk they killed was one less enemy marching on the capital. Zrinski put on his armor, checked his blade, and prepared to die. But the Ottomans had to reach the walls first. The ground shook as the enemy arrived. It was the 2nd of August when the vanguard appeared. The sight was enough to break the mind of a lesser man. The plain was swallowed by a sea of white turbans and gleaming helmets. The noise was physically painful. The thunder of thousands of drums, the screaming of horns, the chanting of prayers. It was psychological warfare on a grand scale. The Sultan wanted to terrify the defenders into submission before a single shot was fired. He set up his camp on the hills overlooking the swamp. It was a display of obscene luxury in the middle of a war zone. Silk tents, gold-woven banners, servants, and kitchens. It was a mobile palace meant to show the inevitability of Ottoman dominance. Suleiman watched from his pavilion, his eyes fixed on the defiant Hungarian flag waving above the mud. He gave the order. The time for intimidation was over. The time for slaughter had begun. However, Szigetvár was not a simple target. It was a nightmare of engineering. The fortress was divided into 3 sections: the new town, the old town, and the citadel. They were connected by narrow bridges and causeways, surrounded by deep water and treacherous marshes. You could not just march up to the walls. You had to bleed for every step. The Ottoman artillery opened up on the 6th of August. The sound was deafening. Great plumes of smoke erupted from the batteries as iron balls hammered the walls of the new town. Stone shattered. Shrapnel flew like hail. The defenders crouched behind the battlements, gripping their muskets, waiting for the infantry assault that inevitably followed the barrage. And then they came. Thousands of foot soldiers surged forward across the causeways. They moved like a single organism, shouting the name of God. But Zrinski had prepared a killing zone. As the Turks crowded onto the narrow bridges, the defenders opened fire. Muskets roared. Cannons loaded with grapeshot turned the front ranks into a mist of red spray. The swamp water began to turn pink. Men fell, screaming, trampled by those behind them. The Ottoman discipline was legendary, but even they could not march through a wall of lead. The first attack was repulsed, the second was shattered. The third ended in a chaotic retreat. Suleiman watched the failure with cold fury. He realized that brute force alone would not crack this nut. He needed to be smarter. He ordered his engineers forward. If they could not walk to the walls, they would drain the swamp. Thousands of laborers began to dig drainage ditches under heavy fire. They built mounds of earth to protect the gunners. They slowly, methodically strangled the fortress. The pressure on the new town became unbearable. The walls were crumbling under the relentless pounding of the heavy siege guns. Zrinski saw the cracks forming. He saw the exhaustion in his men's eyes. He knew that if the Ottomans breached the new town while his men were still inside, it would be a massacre. He had to make a hard choice. A commander's choice. He would destroy it himself. On the 9th of August, Zrinski gave the order. Torches were thrown into the thatched roofs of the new town. Within minutes, the houses were engulfed in flames. The fire roared, creating a barrier of heat and choking smoke. Under the cover of this inferno, the defenders retreated across the bridge to the old town. When the Ottomans finally stormed the breach, they found nothing but ashes and silence. They had captured a graveyard of charred timber. There was no loot. There were no prisoners, only the mocking laughter of Zrinski's men from the walls of the old town, further back, still secure, still ready to kill. But this was only the first round. The Ottomans were relentless. They dragged their heavy cannons through the still smoking ruins of the new town. They set up batteries closer, point-blank range. Now, the old town was in the crosshairs. The bombardment intensified. It went on day and night. Sleep became impossible. The defenders were living in a constant earthquake. The stone walls of the old town began to pulverize under the impact of 20-pound iron balls. The heat was suffocating. It was August in a swamp. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. Disease began to spread in the Ottoman camp. Dysentery killed men faster than bullets. The stench of unburied bodies, rotting in the summer sun, hung over the battlefield like a poison fog. But Suleiman did not care. He had bodies to spare. He threw wave after wave of janissaries at the walls. These were the elite, the Sultan's personal guard, men raised from childhood to do one thing: kill. They charged with a ferocity that terrified the Europeans. They used grappling hooks, scaling ladders, and explosives. They climbed over the piles of their own dead to reach the battlements. The fighting on the walls was primal. It was hand-to-hand, knife to throat. Muskets were used as clubs. Men grappled and fell together into the moat below, drowning in the mud while stabbing each other. Zrinski was everywhere. He was a demon in armor. He rallied his men, plugged gaps in the line, and fought shoulder to shoulder with common soldiers. He knew the psychology of his men. As long as he stood, they would stand. But the numbers were grinding them down. By the 19th of August, the situation in the old town was critical. The walls were breached in 3 places. The water in the moat had dried up due to the summer heat and the Ottoman drainage works. The natural defense was gone. The enemy could now walk right up to the ramparts. Zrinski looked at his dwindling forces. They had killed thousands of Turks. The ground in front of the walls was carpeted with bodies, but for every Turk that fell, 2 more took his place. The Ottoman army was like a hydra. You cut off a head and it just grew back with sharper teeth. He had to contract his lines again. The citadel, the final stronghold, a small, fortified island within the island. It was the last refuge. It was tiny, cramped, and brutally exposed. But it was all they had left. Zrinski ordered the retreat from the old town. Once again, they fell back, giving ground to buy time. They barricaded the gates of the citadel. Now, 2,300 men had become barely 800 effective fighters. They were crammed into a space meant for half that number. There was no way out. The bridge behind them was cut. The enemy was in front of them, and the Sultan was losing his patience. Suleiman was furious. A siege that should have lasted days had dragged on for weeks. His army was bleeding energy. His officers were grumbling. The march to Vienna was being delayed by a handful of stubborn Hungarians in a swamp. He decided to decapitate the snake. He sent a messenger to the citadel. The offer was simple. If Zrinski surrendered, he would be spared. He would be made the ruler of Croatia. He would be given gold, lands, and power. He would be a prince of the empire. Zrinski listened to the offer. He looked at his battered men. He looked at the Ottoman messenger. And he gave his answer. It was not a speech, it was a gunshot. He rejected the bribe with a violence that shocked the Sultan. There would be no deal. There would be no surrender. Zrinski sent a counter-message wrapped in iron. We will never belong to anyone but God and the grave. The Sultan's rage was absolute. He ordered the final assault. He wanted Zrinski's head on a pike. He wanted the citadel erased from the earth. The Ottoman artillery focused every single gun on the tiny citadel. The noise was apocalyptic. The walls shook so violently that men were knocked off their feet. But inside the Ottoman camp, a secret disaster was unfolding. While the cannons roared, the silence in the Sultan's tent grew heavier. Suleiman was dying. The stress of the siege, the heat, and the rage had pushed his failing body over the edge. His physicians were helpless. The most powerful man on earth was being defeated by his own mortality. This was the variable no one had calculated. If the Sultan died, the army would dissolve. The janissaries would stop fighting to demand their customary bonus for a new sultan. The viziers would rush back to Constantinople to secure their power. The siege would collapse. Grand Vizier Sokollu Mehmed Pasha knew this. He was the real power behind the throne, a master of statecraft. He watched the Sultan's breathing slow. He watched the light fade from the eyes of the Lion of Islam. On the night of September 6th, Suleiman the Magnificent took his last breath. The king was dead, but the war could not know. Sokollu Mehmed Pasha made a decision that chilled the blood. He ordered the physicians to be silent on pain of death. He ordered the Sultan's body to be washed and dressed. They removed the heart and internal organs, burying them secretly under the floor of the tent to prevent the smell of rot. They embalmed the body and placed it on the throne, in the shadows, propped up to look like he was watching the battle. The orders continued to flow from the tent. The Sultan demands another attack. The Sultan is displeased with the progress. The army marched forward, driven by the will of a ghost. Inside the citadel, Zrinski did not know his enemy was dead. He only knew that the end was near. The walls were practically gone. The citadel was a pile of rubble held together by desperation. They had no water. They were drinking the blood of horses. They had no food. They were eating boiled leather. But their spirit was unbroken. The Ottomans began to build a great mound of earth and wood against the citadel wall. They planned to simply walk over the top of the defenses and flood the interior with bodies. They worked under the cover of huge shields, protected by sharpshooters. It was a slow, inevitable, creeping death. September 7th dawned. The sun rose red through the smoke. The final assault was prepared. The janissaries sharpened their scimitars. The drums began a low, rhythmic beat that sounded like a giant heart. Inside, Zrinski gathered what was left of his men. There were barely 600 left alive, and most of them were wounded. They looked like specters, bandages soaked in old blood, eyes hollow with fatigue, armor dented and broken, but they stood in formation. Zrinski looked at them. He knew he could not hold the walls another day. If they stayed, they would be slaughtered like cattle in a pen. They would die, trapped, burned, or starved. That was not a death fit for these men. He made his final tactical decision, the most audacious move of the entire siege. They would not wait for the Turks to come in. They would go out. He went to his quarters. He took off his battered combat armor. He washed the blood from his face. He put on his finest silk robe, a garment of diamond-studded velvet. He placed 100 gold coins in his pocket. He told his chamberlain, "Let the man who loots my body find something for his trouble. I will not be a poor corpse." He took his father's saber, a heavy blade that had tasted Turkish blood 1,000 times. He put on a hat with a heron's feather. He did not look like a man about to die. He looked like a man about to go to a wedding. He ordered the bridge to the citadel gate to be lowered. The heavy chains rattled. The timber groaned. The bridge slammed down onto the causeway with a dull thud that echoed across the silent water. The Ottoman troops waiting on the other side were stunned. They froze. They expected a desperate defense, huge explosions, maybe a white flag. They did not expect the gates to open, and then they saw him. Nikola Zrinski stood in the gateway. Behind him, the 600 ghosts of Szigetvár. He drew his saber. The steel hissed against the scabbard. He raised it high, pointing it at the heart of the Ottoman army. He didn't scream. He didn't hesitate. He simply charged. A single iron cannon roared. This was not a salute. It was a shotgun blast from hell. Zrinski had loaded a heavy mortar with broken iron chains and jagged scraps of metal. As the bridge lowered, he fired it point blank into the mass of janissaries waiting on the other side. The effect was immediate and grotesque. The front ranks of the Ottoman elite were turned into a red mist. The blast cleared a path through the meat and bone, opening a corridor of death on the narrow causeway. And into that corridor, Zrinski ran. This was not a battle strategy found in any manual. This was a suicide pact in motion. The 600 defenders, screaming the name of Jesus, slammed into the Ottoman lines with the force of a runaway train. They were not fighting to survive. They were fighting to take as many souls with them as possible. The bridge became a slaughterhouse. There was no room to swing a sword properly. Men stabbed with daggers, gouged eyes, used their shields as bludgeons. The janissaries, who had spent weeks mocking the island rats, were suddenly reeling back. They had never seen ferocity like this. It is terrifying to fight men who have already accepted they are dead. But the weight of numbers is a law of physics, and physics is cruel. For every janissary Zrinski cut down, 3 more climbed over the corpses to get at him. The Ottoman officers screamed at their men to hold the line. Muskets cracked from the flanks. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and wet copper. Zrinski was the target. Everyone saw the man in the red silk coat and the heron feather hat. He was a beacon in the chaos. A musket ball hit him in the chest. He stumbled. The force of a heavy lead ball at close range is like a sledgehammer, but he didn't fall. He straightened up, blood staining the red silk darker, and swung his saber again. Another shot rang out. This one took him in the shoulder. Still, he moved forward. Legend says he shouted, "I am not done yet." But the end was inevitable. An arrow, fired by a Turkish archer from the bank, struck him in the right eye. The world went black for Count Nikola Zrinski. His knees hit the wooden planks of the bridge. He tried to stand one last time, his hand grasping for a sword he could no longer see. The janissaries swarmed over him like ants on a fallen sugar cube. They didn't just kill him, they unmade him. His body was dragged from the crush. They hoisted him onto the barrel of a cannon. An Ottoman executioner, eager to claim the bounty, severed his head with a single stroke. The head was mounted on a pike immediately. The trophy the Sultan had demanded was finally theirs, or so they thought. With their leader dead, the remaining defenders were quickly overwhelmed. They were pushed back into the castle courtyard. They were hacked down where they stood. There was no quarter given. The janissaries, maddened by the weeks of resistance and the humiliation of the siege, butchered everyone. But then, the discipline broke. This is the moment where an army becomes a mob. The janissaries knew that the citadel was full of the nobility's treasures. They believed gold, jewels, and fine silks were waiting in the cellars. They forgot their ranks. They forgot their orders. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers poured into the tiny fortress. They squeezed through the gates, climbing over the bodies of Zrinski's men, shouting for loot. The Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, watched from a distance. He saw the Ottoman flags go up on the battlements. He saw the victory. He breathed a sigh of relief. The nightmare was over. He could now announce the victory, bury the Sultan, and go home. He was wrong. The nightmare had just begun. Deep in the bowels of the citadel, underneath the stone floors now vibrating with the boots of the looters, there was a magazine. It held 3,000 pounds of gunpowder, and there was a fuse. History debates who lit it. Some say it was a young woman, the last survivor of Zrinski's household. Others say it was a soldier named Tushkin who had stayed behind for this exact purpose. It doesn't matter who did it. What matters is the cold, hard resolve it required. Imagine the scene. Above you, the enemy is celebrating. They are screaming in triumph, ripping tapestries from the walls, fighting over coins, and you are standing in the dark, holding a torch, watching a slow match hiss towards a mountain of black powder. You know that in 10 seconds you will be vaporized. But you also know that you are about to deliver the single hardest punch in the history of siege warfare. The fuse burned down. The spark hit the powder. The earth ceased to exist. The explosion was not just a sound. It was a physical blow that knocked men down miles away in the main camp. The entire central tower of the citadel lifted into the air. Stone, timber, iron, and thousands of Ottoman soldiers were blasted into the sky. Observers said it looked like a volcano had erupted in the middle of the marsh. A mushroom cloud of debris hung over Szigetvár. Huge blocks of masonry, the size of carriages, rained down on the surrounding troops. The shockwave flattened the wooden bridges. The water in the moat was blown out, leaving wet mud filled with shattered bodies. Inside the citadel, 3,000 janissaries died in a fraction of a second. They didn't even hear the noise. One moment they were looting a dead man's castle, the next they were dust. The devastation was absolute. The debris rain killed hundreds more outside the walls. The fires started by the explosions swept through the Ottoman camp. Panic seized the army. The soldiers thought it was divine retribution. They thought the sky was falling. When the smoke finally cleared, hours later, the silence was terrifying. The citadel was gone. In its place was a smoking crater surrounded by twisted ruins. The Grand Vizier looked at the destruction. He had his victory. Szigetvár was taken, but his army was broken. The elite corps of the janissaries had been decimated. The morale was shattered. And in the royal tent, the sultan was a rotting corpse propped up on a throne. This was a catastrophe masquerading as a triumph. The cost of this little fortress was staggering. The numbers are debated, but modern historians estimate the Ottoman losses at between 20 and 30,000 men. To put that in perspective, they lost more men taking this one crumbling castle than many armies lost in entire wars. And the time. That was the real killer. It was now mid-September. The Hungarian autumn was turning aggressively cold. The rains were beginning. The roads to Vienna were turning into rivers of mud. Moving heavy artillery through that muck was impossible. The horses were dying of starvation. The men were sick, demoralized, and terrified of the cursed land. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha looked at the calendar. He looked at the map. He realized that Zrinski had won. The dead man in the red silk coat had checkmated the empire from beyond the grave. By holding out for 33 days and by destroying the army in the process, Zrinski had closed the window for the invasion. Vienna was saved, not by a grand army of the Holy Roman Empire, but by a delay. The Grand Vizier forged the Sultan's signature one last time. He issued the order to retreat. The retreat was a mournful affair. The once proud army, which had arrived with the pomp of a triumph, limped back south. They carried the secret of the Sultan's death with them for weeks, terrified that if the news broke, the soldiers would tear the officers apart. The head of Nicola Zrinski was sent to the Austrian emperor by the vizier. It was meant as a threat, a message of, "Look what happens to those who resist," but it had the opposite effect. When the head arrived, it was treated like a holy relic. Men wept. They saw it not as a defeat, but as the ultimate sacrifice. Europe breathed. The storm had broken itself against the rock of Szigetvár, but the legacy of this battle was far from over. This wasn't just a military engagement, it was a psychological turning point. For decades, the Ottoman Empire had been viewed as an unstoppable force of nature, a divine punishment sent to scourge Christendom. Their armies were invincible, their sultans were gods on earth. Szigetvár shattered that myth. It proved that the Ottoman war machine could be bled. It proved that if you hit them hard enough, if you were willing to pay the ultimate price, they would stop. It was the first crack in the dam, a crack that would widen over the next century until the Ottoman tide eventually receded forever. In the years that followed, the story of Zrinski became legend. It was told in taverns in London, in palaces in Paris, and in the war rooms of Vienna. Cardinal Richelieu, the great French statesman who rarely praised anyone, wrote of Szigetvár. The miracle was that the empire was saved by a fortress that no one thought could hold for a day. Today, if you go to Szigetvár, you will see a park. It is quiet now. The marshes are drained. There is a monument there. It features two men, Suleiman the Magnificent and Nicola Zrinski. They are side by side, two old enemies united by death and history. But looking at the stone faces, you have to ask yourself, what makes a man decide to stay when he can run? What makes a leader burn his own city? What kind of fire burns in the heart of a warrior that is hotter than the powder magazine that destroyed him? The Battle of Szigetvár is not just a story about war. It is a lesson in the terrifying power of human will. It is a reminder that sometimes the only way to win is to burn everything down. The smoke over Szigetvár cleared, but the fog of war was thicker than ever. While the Ottoman engineers were digging through the rubble, trying to find the body of their victory, the Grand Vizier was orchestrating the greatest deception in military history. The army was broken. The season was over. But the most dangerous secret was sitting in the royal carriage. Suleiman the Magnificent was still leading his troops. For 48 days during the long, mud-soaked retreat back to Belgrade, the vizier kept up the charade. It was a macabre theater. The dead sultan was propped up behind curtains. Servants brought food to the tent and took away empty plates, eating the meals themselves. Orders were forged. The soldiers marched, saluted, and died for a corpse. It was only when they were safely deep within Ottoman territory that the truth was revealed. The shockwave was political rather than military. The empire paused, but the damage was already done. The momentum of the unstoppable expansion had hit a wall in the Hungarian marshes. So let's look at the cold, hard reality of what Zrinski actually achieved. Military historians often talk about decisive battles. They usually mean giant clashes like Waterloo or Stalingrad. But Szigetvár proves that a decisive battle can be fought by a handful of men in a swamp. Consider the timeline. The Ottomans arrived in early August. They planned to be in Vienna by late September. That was the window. The logistics of the 16th century were brutal. You could not campaign in Central Europe after October. The roads turned to glue. The forage for horses disappeared. The cold killed men faster than muskets. By holding out for 33 days, Zrinski did not just kill Turks, he killed the calendar. When Szigetvár finally fell on the 7th of September, the campaigning season was dead. The Ottoman army, even if it had been intact, would have had to turn back. But it was not intact. It was gutted. They had fired 17,000 cannonballs. They had used tons of gunpowder. They had lost their best officers. The planned siege of Vienna was canceled. It would be another 117 years before the Ottomans tried to take Vienna again. Think about that. 117 years. That is 4 generations of peace for the Austrian capital. 4 generations bought with the blood of 2,300 men. That is the exchange rate of history. And what of the legacy? In the immediate aftermath, the terror of the Ottoman name began to fade. Before Szigetvár, they were the boogeymen of Europe, invincible, inhuman. After Szigetvár, they were just men. Men who bled, men who made mistakes, men who could be blown up. The Treaty of Adrianople was signed 2 years later, in 1568. It confirmed the status quo. It was a diplomatic way of admitting that the expansion had stalled. The golden age of the Ottoman Empire died in that tent with Suleiman, and its military invincibility died in the explosion of the citadel. But there is a darker, grittier lesson here for us. We often glorify the survivor. We love the stories where the hero escapes at the last second, but Szigetvár is not that story. This is a story about the functionality of martyrdom. Zrinski knew the outcome from day one. He was a rich man. He had estates, family, power. He could have retreated to Vienna and lived out his days in comfort. He could have commanded a division from the rear. No one would have blamed him. The fortress was indefensible, but he stayed. Why? Because some things are worth more than survival. This is a concept that the modern world struggles to understand. For a man like Zrinski, honor was a physical currency. To run would be to die while still breathing. To stay was to live forever, even if his heart stopped beating. He showed his men that a leader does not send troops to die. A leader leads them to death. When he put on that silk coat and opened the gates, he wasn't committing suicide. He was making a statement. He was telling the enemy, "You can take my life, but you cannot take my obedience." That is the essence of the warrior ethos. It is raw, it is violent, and it is undeniable. Today, military academies still study this siege, not for the tactics. Fighting in a burning castle is not a standard doctrine. They study it for the morale. They study it to understand how a commander can keep men fighting when they are eating boiled leather and drinking swamp water. The answer is trust. The men trusted Zrinski not to save them, but to spend their lives well. And he did. He spent them like gold coins, purchasing the safety of a continent. So when you look at the map of Europe today, remember Szigetvár. It is a quiet town now. But under the asphalt and the grass, the ground is still thick with the iron of cannons and the bones of empires. It reminds us that history is not made by the masses. It is not made by committees or politicians in velvet chairs. History is made by the few, the stubborn, the brave, the ones who stand on a wall, look at a horizon filled with enemies, and say, "Not one step back." Nicholas Zrinski and his garrison proved that numbers are just ink on paper. Willpower is blood on stone, and blood always weighs more than ink. This was the Battle of Szigetvár, the battle that saved civilization, the battle that proved that even in the face of absolute destruction, a man can still choose how he ends. If you want more brutal history, more forgotten battles, and more stories of men who refuse to kneel, make sure you subscribe. We dig up the past that others are afraid to touch. This is the reality of war. See you on the next battlefield.